the main point in question would be the Jesus myth. And that's the whole thing. Everybody is willing to look past everything in the New Testament and really not really pay so much attention to the rest of the book. But when it comes to Jesus, this person, did he exist? And, to me, it's just crazy. And it's, you could put Jesus on the same level as Moses, 500 years old, spending 100 years to build an ark. So it's the same type of stuff to me. So it has to be looked at. And the main thing is you have people, supposedly people, pseudepigrapha, when you think about it, you have supposedly people coming forward, giving us these gospels about the so-called life of Jesus Christ. All, suspect things that are in question that we have to look at and examine to determine, what's the truth. Now, again, as I said, just as we went back and looked at Greek history, we can see it correspond with the Bible and fit Greeks, no Jews. It's going to be the same thing in the New Testament, and it's not a coincidence that it's written in Greek. Plain and simple, you got to pay attention to this stuff. How is it that for this long stretch, you have supposedly this Hebrew language that becomes a dead language, which we'll get into that, and then you have the injection of this totally new doctrine, totally new concepts called Christianity that comes and takes place right after this huge war of Rome and the so-called Jews. So, it's so much in question. There's so much that is suspect around this time frame that you got to take a look at it to get the truth. It can't really be just accepted, by this book, by just, taking the Bible and just, saying it's completely true. We have to continue to put it into context with actual history and see where it fits. And does it fit nowhere? And that's the thing. So we're going to start to dig into this and take a look. So now, talked about this in the previous video about how you had during this time. When we're talking about, right around the time before the War of the Jews, you have still supposedly in the Jewish doctrine this whole, prophecy of a warrior, a warrior Messiah coming forth and helping the Jews defeat the Romans. Because you have, according to their history, you have during this time the persecution of Jews being enslaved and Jews being basically, oppressed and, trying to live a normal life. They're being overtaxed by Rome and things are just, outrageous. So the Jews have repeated, skirmishes with the Romans to where you had a lot of young Jews rise up and try to take on the Romans and was defeated. Stuff like this kept happening over and over again. Now, you have this still. You got to understand, one, you have this whole hatred, this whole animosity with the Jews and the Romans. So, when you have Jesus coming in and his doctrine just doesn't fit with that time frame, as I talked about. It just doesn't fit. Where you would have supposedly a Jew walking around Galilee and Jerusalem, preaching, turn the other cheek, preaching to love thy neighbor, preaching. Remember, Jesus says, render to Caesar all things that is basically Caesar, basically pay your taxes. None of this kind of talk would have fit in with the Jews around this time. They would not have tolerated anybody talking like that. They probably would have thought that that person was a spy. So it's far-fetched that, Jesus would be walking around in Jerusalem, Galilee, or what have you, in Israel, preaching this kind of doctrine for so long, and during a time when there was so much war going on between the Jews and the Romans. So this has a history to it. It's a lot to this point that you have to understand. It's basically going back to the War of the Diadochi. So you have with the Seleucid Empire, remember they took over the territory, which part of it would be Israel. Now you have the Hasmoneans, which we know as the Maccabees, basically rise up and fight for their independence, and they would get it around 163, 164 BCE up until about 63, 64 BCE, where they were basically reconquered. Rome came in and took over and re-obtained those lands that the Greeks once owned, And Rome took over, and all the fight and everything that the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, or what have you, done been through, all the fighting was basically, for naught. They had to basically start over again and deal with a whole new, even worse regime than the Greeks. So, Rome came in, took over, and basically set them back. And they was dealing with the oppression of Rome, since then. So now, who was in Israel around this time still? This is the 2nd century BCE. You still have a lot of Africans in Israel. You have a mixed group now, because during this time you had a lot of Edomites or Arabs coming in to Israel, coming into those lands. You have basically now the mixing. You have Greek, you have African, you have Arab in and out of this town, of this place. So it's the same thing. When you go back and look at the Egyptian hieroglyphics, when they showed you who the citizens of Egypt was everybody. You had white, you had African, you had Arab. You can see clear as day how they presented them. This was basically what it looked like throughout, with the so-called Middle East, with the majority before conquest being African people. And that's something that we know. So the rulers, or the people that was in power, or the main majority of the land and everything, belonged to us, of course. And we were in power, of course, until we were conquered. So you have all that going on. So they got to remember, around the time when these wars are happening with the Greeks and then the Romans and the Arabs and everything, the Africans are slowly trickling out of Israel down into lower Africa and other places. And it will eventually be overrun by Arabs and the Greeks, or what have you, which would, give us the Berbers and everything like that. So important to note that. So now history notes the fact that you have these Arabs coming in. They call them the foreigners from Edom, which Edom would be in Arabia. So we're talking about Arabs here. So what would happen, you would have a lot of these Arab groups come in and take over smaller lands from the people, from African people. And what they didn't know was a lot of these lands was controlled by Rome, and Rome didn't care who was living on the land. They taxed the people that was there. So they would come in and basically tax the Arabs, who basically had no clue when they set out to conquer that Rome was taxing these people. So this is where basically Antipater comes in. And Antipater was basically an Edomite or Arab who his family had converted to Judaism, and he would basically get into politics and basically try to pick up where the Maccabees and everybody who was having a problem with Rome, he would basically fit in with the politics of that time, what the Maccabees was talking about, and everybody who had an issue with the taxation of Rome, he would appeal to those people. But at the same time, he was playing both sides. He was also kissing Rome's ass and doing what they wanted them to do. So he knew how to play both parts so well that Julius Caesar basically appointed him as procurator of Judea in 47 BCE, and Caesar basically had him keeping the people in line. Now later his son will basically become governor. We know him as Herod. Herod will be king by the time that Jesus is born and died. So you have this history connection right up front already of Rome having connections with the Arabs. It's important to establish this early, that you have a Roman Caesar who is working with Arabs during this time, because this just makes sense as we go forward. So you have Antipater comes in, he plays both sides, as I said. He moves up in rank, and his son becomes governor, and this is kind of sort of basically what we see them do. Same thing as you'll see later on with Spain, is when Rome comes in and assumes power, they never put their people in that position. They always use the people who they have conquered to control the people. So it's the same type of MO. So if we're conquering Africans, or if we're conquering Arabs, or what have you, or a religious group, we can't put one of our people on the throne. We got to put one of their people on the throne that we own to run things. So then, none of our people get hurt, or nobody knows who the true power is. So this is what Rome was doing. And you had these sellouts, just like we still got sellouts today, who was basically siding with Rome, the power, in exchange for money or power or what have you. So Antipater would do so, and his son Herod will become governor, and they would basically control certain areas. So we look at the Seleucid Empire, excluding Israel, is basically the same as the Parthian Empire. So a lot of people get confused around this time. You have to understand, when you see kings in the same region, like they'll tell you it's the king of Mesopotamia, but then you'll find another king around the same date. You got to understand you have two separate groups of people appointing rulers, governors, or what have you. So you have the Parthians who claim this land to be theirs. You have the Seleucids who claim this land to be theirs. And you have, for a long time, wars go back and forth between the Seleucids and the Parthians until Rome came and assumed power from the Seleucids. And then you had the Parthians basically going to war with Rome. This lasted for a long time. So you have the Jews. Now, according to them, the Jews are basically being conquered in Israel, first by the Greeks, then later by the Romans. But understand, this is again a cover-up for who was really being conquered, which was the African people. So let's just understand that. But we'll go by their interpretation of the history for right now. So supposedly, Jews being conquered by the Seleucids, then later the Romans, and they had this whole prophecy that a warrior would basically come and lead them to war and victory against the Romans. So now enters Antigonus II Metatius. His father was Aristobulus II, who was priest king of Judea when the Maccabees ruled for 3 years. Remember, they fought the Seleucid Empire and defeated them in the War of the Maccabees, where they ruled for about 3 years until Rome came to power and basically took over. When they did so, they basically threw in prison Aristobulus and his son Antigonus II, and they put them in prison in Rome. So later, Antigonus II would escape and go back to Judea, where he found out that his uncle had basically sold out to Antipater. Remember, Caesar put Antipater in power. His son was Herod, who was governor of Judea, basically. So he went and saw that, sold out. Not just him, a lot of the Jews were selling out around this time to Rome, because Rome was in power. And he basically thought that because of everything that took place, and the fact that he was rightfully king and he could rule better because it was rightfully his spot, because his father was king. He actually tried to get his kingdom back. He actually went to Caesar and basically pleaded to Caesar to give him back his kingdom, and that his uncle and everything that was going on was some kind of sham. And of course Caesar didn't do it. So what Antigonus did was he got together a small army and he went and fought against Herod, who basically defeated them. And Antigonus basically had to get a bigger army, and that's exactly what he did. He went out and he basically appealed to the rich people in Judea, the richer Jews, the people who had businesses and stuff like that, that they couldn't stand Rome. And Rome was taxing the crap out of them, and they had problems and issues with Rome. So he got them to, put up money, put up gold, got a lot of men to join. And the Parthians, he got the Parthians to basically come to war with him. He offered them a lot of gold. So you had this war. Parthians, Antigonus, going back into Jerusalem, where they defeated Herod. And Herod went and basically flee to Rome to tell the Romans what happened, that, they basically came in and took power from him. And, Rome was like, well, we're not going to recognize Antigonus as king. We're going to appoint you king. So Rome, without even fighting no war or doing anything else, not knowing the situation that they were in, had already, crowned Herod king of Judea, sent him back with Mark Antony's army to basically fight against the Parthians and Antigonus. So they won. They won that war, and they basically slowly defeated and conquered parts of Jerusalem until they pushed Antigonus into basically a corner. Him and the last bit of his men was basically stuck until the end of the winter. When the winter was over, the army went in there and basically defeated them and captured Antigonus and took him back to Antioch, where he was supposedly crucified and beheaded. So you have Josephus saying that he was beheaded. You have Cassius Dio, who was basically a Roman historian or what have you, who said that he was crucified. So you had these stories where Scholars say he was crucified, some say he was beheaded, some said both. The reason why this is important, of course, is because crucifixions was done before Jesus Christ, of course. But we're going to get back to the story of this crucifixion later because it's important. It fits in. So now, as I said, the Jews was looking for a fighting Messiah, and they got that with Antigonus. Antigonus, he was a warrior, and he put together armies, and he went after Rome not once but twice, multiple times. He went after Rome until he was killed. So a lot of the Jews looked at this as a prophecy that was fulfilled. But, once he died and they was back in the same position, they had to, start all over again. Now, as I said, we can go back and look and prove that a lot of the history that we find, the so-called history we find in the Bible, we can trace back to Greek actual history. And that it's just been plagiarized and transformed into something else and put into the Bible as actual history. But it doesn't fit with no other people on the planet except for the Greeks. So it's the same thing with the Romans, as I said. Same thing with the Romans. When you go back, you start looking at their history of conquest and the things that they went through in their history, there you can start to find parts of the Bible and the New Testament that fits with their actual history. It's no different from the Greeks. So Antigonus was crucified, and the Parthians basically had to go back to little skirmishes back and forth with the Romans. All of this is before the birth of Jesus Christ. So now, after Antigonus was crucified, what happened was, things got worse for the Jews. You would have so many of the priests bought off by Rome, and they would basically sell out. So one of the earliest mentions of a collection plate is during this time, because Rome would basically, while they was in the temple, would tax them right then and there in the temple, and they would send the temple authorities around with collection plates to collect taxes from the people, the Jewish people inside the temple. So just like how we have Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson today to basically keep the black folks in line, it was the same thing for the temple priests back then. Temple authorities, they was basically bought off to try to keep the Jews calm and keep them from rebelling, because they had this history of just constantly rebelling. You had a lot of the youth who would put together groups, and they would always continue to try to start a rebellion or a war with Rome.